Alrighty, Pastor Pam, you are ready to go.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you all for sitting in and being interested in this topic of the great, I don't know what we're calling it, Yellowstone ecosystem flood of 2022. A little bit just real quick about myself. When I arrived in Red Lodge to be the pastor of the community church there in July of 2018, I brought with me many years of experience as a hospital trauma chaplain. I worked for Hartford Healthcare in Hartford, Connecticut for 6 years as one of their staff chaplains, and 3 of those years I focused in trauma. I also come from a long line, many generations of volunteer firemen and folks that serve on the police departments. And so helping and rescuing is sort of what we do. I'm very proud of my sister Sheila, who has been a volunteer EMT for 35 years. So when it comes to disasters and jumping in and helping people, it's just in our nature to do that. I'm not sure which one of Howard Gardner's intelligences that is, but it's who we are. So anyway, on the afternoon of June 12th of 2022, the Yellowstone ecosystem kind of melted down and melted right into the city of Red Lodge in Carbon County, Montana. We were called out, of course, to fill sandbags and help get people out of their homes. The flood happened, it started about 4 p.m, and by 9 o'clock that night, our part of the town had evacuated, and miraculously and thankfully there was no injuries, and there were no deaths. And that was an absolute miracle, because when Rock Creek flooded its banks and came into the town, of course, it filled up all of our basements, mine included, with about 5.5, 6 foot of water. And there were a number of homes that have basement apartments. And so as the flood waters raged throughout the night, people weren't aware. Then the fire department didn't know that there were people living in these basements. And so a couple of people literally made it out within just got out and miraculously lived through it. And so there was that trauma. There was a lot of trauma going on. So anyway, what caused the flood? The theory is we had extremely unusual heavy spring snows in April and May of 2022. And then we got really high temperatures and rain in June. And it very, very rarely rains in Montana, but it did that week. And it rained and rained and rained. And so that is what really caused the flood. And so when it happened, it was completely unexpected. No one ever dreamt in over 500 years that Rock Creek and the Yellowstone River and Clark's Fork would ever flood, and especially wouldn't flood the way it did. So the city of Red Lodge, which has about 3,000 year-round folks that live there, our numbers in the summertime, of course, are a resort community, and where we are the road to Yellowstone one way. And it's about 10,000 people there in the summer. So we had a lot of visitors, tourists, which that's what helps us pay the bills. There wasn't a Sunday in the 4 years I was at the Red Lodge Community Church that I hadn't had about 4 or 5 visitors, with the exception of the pandemic. So the area of the city that was affected, Red Lodge isn't a very big city, but the area that sits right along Rock Creek and that flooded, the majority of us that live there, we are renters. We either rent the property we live in, or they're landlords who live upstairs and rent out their basements or their duplexes, and they rent out half their houses. So the population that was affected was the working class population. The streets were destroyed. They were washed away. They were filled with stones and boulders. And so you know how gallows humor works. The one thing that we did chuckle about on occasion was that we had all meant to get into zero landscaping, and now we had zero landscaping to worry about. So the church that I served at the time, the Red Lodge Community Church, our church sits right just 1 block away from the creek. In our church basement, the fellowship hall, and our preschool area were all damaged. We sustained a little over $100,000 in damage. The good news is that with a whole lot of help and volunteers, it has been completely restored. And the flood happened June 12th, and we reopened and celebrated being completely back 100% by November 1st. So it was because of so many volunteers that pitched in to help us get our church rebuilt. The disaster recovery process for me as the pastor and as someone that, knew enough about disasters to help, really focused on working with our VOAD group, which swooped right in and said, this is what we do and this is how we work. What do you need and what are the unmet needs? The Salvation Army, thank you, sent us Jim Antle from Cody, Wyoming, and he was right there in Red Lodge and at my side for days. And he helped explain and taught me how to do a mark. So we were able to have a very successful mark. We had about 120 people that showed up at the mark. And of course, the Red Cross came and they opened up the initial shelter and they got our food system working. So we were able to feed the people that couldn't get into their homes and feeding the volunteers who were coming literally by the busloads, which we are so appreciative of. And they helped get that going. So working within those are the organizations that I worked most directly with, just as the pastor there at the community church. And of course, working side by side with our county commissioners to make sure that we can find the resources that we needed to get those taken care of. Worked very, very closely with the mayor of Red Lodge, and then worked with our disaster services as well. So it really, for not having any plan at all for a flood, I'm very, very proud of our little community of Red Lodge and the county. Carbon County also encompasses not just our little city, but a lot of ranch land. And so that ranch land flooded. So the agricultural hit was huge because there's very little funding to help the agricultural disaster when that happens. So they're still working on getting that taken care of, I know. So when we think about trauma response, which is really sort of what I brought to the flood, is my experience working with traumatized people. First of all, it was hard for me because I was a victim of the flood. And regretfully, I wasn't able to upload some of the pictures I had of my own that I really could have shared. I had some computer trouble this week. But I had to have my dogs rescued out of my house by someone that I didn't even know. And they just volunteered because I got out of my house. And by the time I went to go back to the house to get my dogs, I couldn't get there. And so this man said, hey, I have a dry suit. I'm a kayaker. I will go get your dogs. Total stranger. Puts on his dry suit and risked his life to cross the street because it was still flooding to rescue my dogs out of my house. So the trauma of going through that and knowing how dangerous things were, that's what really started to set in with our community. And we continue to work living within that trauma even now, 10 months later. Part of the reason is a lot of people were reticent to reach out for help for spiritual support or for emotional support. So that's a part of the reason that it takes a lot longer to recover. One of the other pieces that made the recovery difficult was we don't know if this is going to happen again. And so this week I've been in constant contact with my neighbors and my friends. I moved out of Montana to Idaho 2 weeks ago. And so I've been in touch with my neighbors because they got another 5 or 6 feet of snow in the last 2 weeks. And then I got really, really warm and was starting to melt really fast, but it cooled off. And so far there hasn't been any flood damage, but the fear of that happening again has prevented a lot of people from being able to work through their trauma in the time that we've had to work together to work through it. So between the threat of it happening again and being reticent to reach out for help to be able to process, that has really made it very, very difficult to engage in good emotional and spiritual recovery, resulting in, some of us moving away from Red Lodge. Some people had to move away because they lost their houses and their jobs. So yeah, it's very complicated. So recovering from trauma is, it's its own set of complications. So that was sort of it in a nutshell. Another reason that I wanted to share with you that Well, I wasn't able to get the video that I had access to before, and the person that has access to that video was so busy this week filling sandbags in preparation for the possibility of the flood happening again that I wasn't able to get the video to show. But then another thing that happened in the last week is I was trying to get my computer to cooperate and go back and pull forward some of the pictures that I had taken that I thought I could use. I happened to see someone had posted some pictures on social media, and they said, hey, I'm going to write a book about the flood. And these are the pictures that I want to use, but I don't know who took them. Can I get permission? And one of the other things that continued to traumatize us in the time of the flood was people standing in our yards and taking pictures and posting them. And then when you experience that and you see a picture of your house surrounded by raging floodwaters, and you remember how traumatic it was, and then you see it publicly posted without your permission, and some of us didn't own our homes, so we couldn't have given permission anyway, that in and of itself has a pretty negative effect on us. So as I'm trying to come up with pictures that I knew I had permission to use, and then watching this pop up on social media, it made it really hard to come up with a slide presentation to show you all the pictures of what we went through. So just imagine what you saw on the news. Imagine what it would feel like to walk out into your yard and almost get swept away by raging waters, to hear the stories of people who had to kick out the windows to swim out of their houses. And you'll get a picture of what it was that we lived through. The recovery for Red Lodge is going really well. Like I said, our church is completely rebuilt, and they were in great shape when I left. Many of the houses had been able to get rebuilt to a certain degree. Some of them actually got finished. One of the local community buildings that we use for a lot of different arts and crafts and shows and whatnot, they were almost completely refurbished enough to be able to reopen and, welcome the community for different things there. So that's what I know about the rebuild. And as far as the major infrastructure, the road there, the State Highway 212 that goes through Red Lodge and up over Bear Creek Pass and into their Beartooth Pass and into the Yellowstone, that's still in the process of being rebuilt. They're trying to get they worked on it all winter long, so they're trying to get those things shored up. The bridges that were replaced, the majority of them were replaced with temporary bridges. So we still now need to go back in and do some permanent bridge rebuilding. So that's sort of what's going on with that. There was a lot of work done and still being done. And I'll, cooperate with this as best I can and give my suggestions to make the next flood plan as far as how to, get through another flood disaster. But they were still trying to rebuild from the first one to make the plan for what could they do for the next one. And so there was, a lot of traumatic response to that in the last week, as I said. So that is it. That's really what I have to share. It's the experience of a rescuer needing to be rescued, a rescuer in the middle of the mess, learning how to create a system. I knew enough on creating a house of worship disaster response plan to be able to help as best I could. But one of the things I recommend to anyone here that's connected with a house of worship of any kind, make sure that your town has a house of worship disaster response plan, because those are the people that can really, really help the most, the quickest. We have a lot of volunteer ability. And so, as far as making your food and getting your water together and providing transportation and getting people out of town, if that's what you need to do, I can't speak highly enough of the recommendation to create. And that's what it's called, as a house of worship disaster response plan. And so Carbon County has been working on getting ours even firmer than it was. We have about 20 churches in the county, and they all work together great at trying to make the next plan, regretfully, for the next disaster, but that's the one thing that we do try to do. So I think at this point, I love communication and I love conversation, not just hearing myself talk. So I know we got about 20 minutes, but I would love to just entertain questions, and I can try to be a little bit more descriptive, being that I didn't have pictures to share. But so I'd like to open the floor, and however we can do that. Okay, so Dallas is asked to tell us about, here we go, the response we had of volunteers throughout the area. Montana has a small population, so getting numbers to come and help people recover is more difficult. So my experience with getting volunteers to help was phenomenal. Volunteers from all of the different denominations showed up literally by the truckload and the busload. So that we did, and the county had immediately asked one of the local organizations who already had a database of volunteers if they would help coordinate that, and they did a great job. Actually ended up taking their employee and recruiting him to now work professionally for the Red Cross. Go Eric, I'm very proud of him. And so the people who weren't affected by the flood, there was a volunteer tent set up in the flood zone, and you would just go give them your telephone number and your name and say, give me the next house to go muck out, or, where's the tent? What do you need me to cook? Do you need me to go get supplies? So that worked wonderfully. And we did have great volunteers, both individually and groups. So the flood hit, and it was a Monday, I think it was. By Saturday, I had a busload of folks from a completely different church denomination up in Billings that called and said, what do you want us to do to help your church? We heard your church flooded. So they came and helped us tear out all of the damage in the basement of the church, so that we didn't have to pay to have that done. So that was one of the reasons we were able to bounce back so quickly. And so all of the organizations, and I hate to name them because I'm so afraid I would miss a key one, but every denomination showed up somehow. Let me just put it that way. And they didn't care who you were. It had nothing to do with your faith system or your belief system. They simply knocked on your door and said, what do you need? And cleaned out our basements and hauled the muck and hauled away the trash, and at their own expense, asked for nothing in return. So I think that one of the things that I came away from that with was, the next time I am able myself to respond to a completely different neighborhood, maybe a different state, if I can go help with a disaster, boy, I sure am going to do that. So that was good. Yes, crisis cleanup. Thank you, Dallas. That's a whole new miracle in my life. So crisis cleanup worked great. And so Red Lodge, Montana is in south central Montana, and it is an hour in north to go to Billings to get anything other than your most basic supplies. So it's an hour to Billings to get any big supplies you need, any kind of. We have a really good Ace Hardware store, and we've got a really good privately owned lumber yard. But if you needed anything other than what they had, you've got to drive either an hour north to Billings or an hour south to Cody. And then remember, some of those roads were still closed for the first few days after the flood, so we couldn't get out of Red Lodge if we wanted to. So crisis cleanup worked great because we could put the address and exactly what was needed for volunteers, and the volunteer groups connected to crisis cleanup went there and said, okay, we need to go to this certain address. They need mucked out. Let's take our buckets. Let's go. And when they got it done, they checked it off the list. So if you don't know about crisis cleanup, you don't know how to use it. I know that they've got folks there with you today, this weekend in Salt Lake City. Please learn the system. It is easy. It's fast. You can learn it in a morning. They will teach you how to use it. And if there's one thing that when I was leaving Red Lodge, I said, please, please, please make sure that somebody in this town understands how vitally important it is to use crisis cleanup, because they help keep the disorganization organized. Okay, long-term recovery group. Thank you. So that was one of the hitches. There was a few, as you would expect there to be. So a long-term recovery group really needs to start working parallel to the immediate financial recovery group. we didn't know that. Well, how would we have known that? And so we were told that there was a whole bunch of money to be sought after, that there were grant money to go get and to help that would help our community. So the long-term recovery group we started it with a group of pastors. There were about 5 of us, pastors and reps from the churches. And we thought we were going to be able to do some grant writing. And we thought that there were grant writers that were going to help us. Now, the one big grant we got was Lowe's. So Lowe's does give disaster recovery grants. It's great. You just have to figure out how to use it once you get the money. And then we found out that we were given the wrong information, and that they're really, if you know of grants, please share it with somebody, because we couldn't find any more grant money. And because Red Lodge is, like I said, there's only 3,000 people there year round. And the businesses were already struggling because of the results of the pandemic. But we also had a wildfire on June 12th of 2021. And the air quality got so bad that the businesses took a huge hit because of that wildfire. So they're still trying to recover from that. So a long-term recovery group normally would be philanthropists, where they would go out and be able to ask local businesses for more donations. And the businesses, in a perfect world, would be able to donate more money towards recovery. Regretfully, our town was just too small, and our business they'd been tapped beyond tapped. And so what we were able to do was say, we can help you, first of all, with emotional and spiritual care. We want to get people talking about their recovery, talking about living with the disasters. And then we also let them know that our churches were still able to give a little bit of help financially. And some of our churches are connected to bigger, broader denominational help, which we could still do. But by then, the pastors pretty much wanted to get back to their own work in their own churches, rather than trying to stay as one consolidated recovery group. So that's something that I highly recommend people having conversations about in your disaster recovery plan. So when your house of worship plan says, oh, we can do water, we can do cots, we can do food, ask, what can you do as a long-term recovery group? How are you able to help with that? Because financially, there just isn't disaster recovery money. We know that insurance only does so much. FEMA can only do just so much. And so that long-term financial disaster recovery, that is a huge piece of it, of which I hope to learn even more about. And there was another question, so I want to just check and make sure. Whoops, hang on, I'm sorry. There we go. Okay, Dallas is saying, I'm asking all the questions. Okay, yes, there is a time when volunteers become tired, and it's harder to get their continued involvement, especially after the media coverage starts to disappear. And I do agree with that. We were pretty exhausted. So my experience with FEMA individual assistance, I personally didn't qualify to add, because I rented, and so what was lost out of my basement wasn't something I would have replaced anyway. But my neighborhood, so my neighbors, some of them were able to get immediate FEMA individual assistance. What's important is you have to make sure that you're keeping the good records going into it, so that your county will qualify for the FEMA individual assistance. And you do that by signing every time you volunteer, or every time you've donated an item, like all the fans that got donated, the dehumidifiers that got donated, every time you use your vehicle to drive to Billings and back to get a load of food or whatever. You have to write all that down. The Red Cross got us started in keeping the track of all of that. So your county disaster response people know to keep track of all that. That's what helps your town or your county qualify for the individual disaster assistance. And it is important to help people understand how to apply for that, and then they can get it. So in a flood situation, one of the things that was a drawback was that people were told that they had to get flood insurance in order to qualify for any further FEMA assistance. And there's a lot of language and logistics around that I am not qualified to explain by any means, but ask the questions. Ask those questions of the FEMA reps. Ask them, how does this work? If we accept this money now as individual assistance, what does this mean for future? What do we have to do to make sure we can also get it in the future? But my relationship in working with FEMA was very good. For your church folks that are there, there's a specific grant. It's called a House of Worship Disaster Grant. And so that is separate from your city grant, that's separate from your municipality getting FEMA assistance. And there's a way to go through that and process all of that. We were approved by FEMA to receive our House of Worship grant. Now the church, and I checked on this yesterday, they're still waiting because it goes from FEMA to your state. So they're just waiting for the people in the state of Montana to get that officially granted back to the church. So yeah, my experience with FEMA was actually very good, both as a pastor of the church and as an individual in the neighborhood, encouraging my neighbors to go fill out the FEMA paperwork and to understand exactly how that all works. So are there any other questions?
All right, Pastor Pam, we are going to open it up to anyone in the room that has a question. And then before you start answering the question, I would just ask you give me about 10 seconds to turn your audio back on so we can all hear it. So does anyone have a question for Pastor Pam? You want to? And then remember to move it. Yeah.
Hey, Pastor Pam, this is Scott O'Connell with the Red Cross, and I have a bit of a comment, and then I'll try to turn it into a little bit of a question. But I have heard your name mentioned probably 50, 60, 100 times, all amazing things. And Eric Allen, I am sorry that I stole him from Red Lodge, but I'm also very excited that I stole him from Red Lodge because he's great as well. And he has spoken really highly of you. And the role that you played in that long-term recovery. And so as we look, the Red Cross keeps saying we're kind of going from acute to chronic. Our layout at the Red Cross is the East Montana, 27 counties are managed by one disaster program manager, having about 20 to 30 volunteers covering all 27 of those counties. And so as we're looking at rural communities and as we're looking at really small populations, trying to understand from your approach being more of a facilitator and bringing the right people together, what are the things that you would like to see a city, a town, a county doing more of before the disaster happens? And even specifically the Red Cross. One of the things I keep saying is we can't just be an NGO. We got to go back to being a CBO. And that's really hard when you got 27 counties. And so I would love any advice on that as I'm newer in my role trying to help support all these counties as well.
Okay, that's great. And thank you. I think that one of the things is it's education. So working closely, finding your Pastor Pam in your community. And I know who I left in charge when I left. So I know exactly who the person stepping into my shoes is. And making sure that that House of Worship disaster plan exists and it's on paper, and that your county commissioners have that, and that your Department of Emergency Services person has that. I still need to wrap mine a little bit tighter, I think. So that's the one thing. And the piece that we, really worked hard to try to keep flowing, but kind of lost a little bit in Red Lodge, and it's to be expected, it was a disaster. And that was the feeding program. So if I had known from day one that we needed to get ahead of the game on keeping those meals in the location that they were in, and keeping our volunteer cooks volunteering or finding the money. The churches would gladly have paid the money to get that food cooked and delivered. Those community meals, that's where the healing was taking place. We were able to sit with neighbors and cry together and hold each other's hands and ask questions and then refer people to the next place to get the help that they needed or to refer them as best we could. So that would be my one big thing for the Red Cross is, and I know Eric has taught me so much more about the Red Cross, but let the volunteers help you by being organized, but really encourage that they find the pastors and the lay people in the churches that can help with that communication, and then regularly show up at the monthly LEPAC meetings or whatever the community uses for disaster planning, that somebody from those churches and your ministerium stays involved so that you know that we can keep going what the Red Cross comes and starts. That would be my biggest piece of advice.
Hi, Pastor Pam. This is Alan. I'm with Lutheran's Social Services in Anchorage, also the Alaska VOAD. You talk of this House of Worship plan. Is that something that's in FEMA resources or anything you could share with us? Okay. Oh, okay.
All right. So I was trained to do a House of Worship disaster plan by FEMA was part of the training. There's a National Disaster Network for Chaplains. If you just Google it, National Disaster Network for Chaplains, you'll find it. Somebody might even be there that can give you the exact title of that. I should have been prepared. And that's where I learned how to do a disaster plan for the houses of worship. And if Kira has my contact information, it's easy. It's Pastor Pam Peterson at gmail.com. But I would be happy to get those details to you. So yes, that is the group. That's where you go to the trainings. As a matter of fact, we just sent another pastor from Montana to be trained. Usually the trainings are in New York City. And it's interfaith chaplaincy. So it's everybody that is interested in that line of vocation. And that's where you learn how to do it. And then you tweak it according to, your location. So yeah, and go Lutherans in Alaska. There's only 2 UCC churches in the whole state. So we're trying. But yeah, so please do reach out and find a way to get a hold of me. And I'd be more than happy to give you more information on that. The other place that churches learn how to work with FEMA is if you can get somebody to take a critical incident stress management course. Even just level 1, you take those courses and those have pieces in it of how to work a disaster and how to work with FEMA. But critical incident stress management coursework also teaches you that.
So the question was, can you speak on the mark and how long it went and what you did?
Yes, the mark. So a mark, the letters are MARC. Multi-Agency Resource Center. And what we did, and I can't take the credit because Jim Antal from Salvation Army is the person that took me by the hand and said, this is what we do. So you contact all of your agencies that are able to respond to the disaster. So Red Cross, Salvation Army, the LDS Church, the UCC Church, any other churches in your area, Lutheran Social Services, if you have somebody that's there for that. The Humane Society got involved. Who else was there? And of course, your county health department was there. Oh, I know, Department of Labor was there. And then legal advocacy came down from Helena, Montana to be there. I think there were 12 organizations altogether. And what you do is you set your date and your time. And it's generally just it's like 2 to 4 hours. Even though it's called a multi-agency resource center, you really don't set up a center and leave it sent up. This is a 1 day, 1 afternoon, or 1 evening thing. So we did 2. We did 1 in Red Lodge, and then we did 1 in Fromberg, which is a tiny little 4 corners in Carbon County. But they were hit as well, and they were more agriculturally hit than we were. So what you do is these people come, it's like a vendor show. So they come and set up a whole table with pamphlets and giveaways and, business cards. This is who to call to get more information from us. And you take people's information. So the victims of the disaster, I should say survivors of the disaster, come, and then you collect your pamphlets and your business cards. You leave your name with the Red Cross. You leave your name with the Salvation Army. You leave your name with the UCC or the SS and say, oh, this is what I have. I'm married with 4 children. I'm now out of work. I'm living in a tent. And so whatever agency can help you is there, and they'll take your name. They come and find you afterwards. You take their name. You know what office to go to get help. So you get so many of your questions answered. And so that's what a mark is. And I happen to, I've done a lot of fun, fascinating things in my life. One of the things I did years and years ago was I was a bridal consultant. So I used to do bridal shows. So I knew how to do a vendor show. I was like, oh, that's a vendor show. You just get 12 to 20 organizations to show up. We had it at it was the building, the Civic Center. So the school brought the tables and chairs, and we set up, what was there? I think 12 or 14 organizations. You set their chairs up around the outside and then, or tables, and then they bring their own displays. And then the local pizzeria donated, I don't even remember how many stacks were in that, boxes were in that stack of pizzas. So you got pizza and juice and water for people. And then you collect their names and addresses, and then that's your communication center. But it only lasts about 2 to 4 hours because the volunteers need to get back to work, but people need to get back to recovering. So that's what a mark is, and that's how you set it up. And ours was very, very successful, very well attended. But thank you to the Salvation Army, and thank you to Jim for knowing, hey, we need to get this rolling. We got to get this done. And you do want to do it really as soon as you can after the disaster has sort of stopped, when the floodwaters had stopped. And we were able to get ours done pretty quickly.
Alrighty, Pastor Pam, that was all the questions that we had. So thank you so much. I know that I will be sharing your contact information with anyone here as well. And then Pastor Pam, if you could just put your contact information in the chat for our online folks, that would be great. And then, yeah, we wish you a good afternoon.
Thank you very, very much.